Mark Mitcher made a very bold decision on June 20th, 1944. It was World War II, and during the Battle of the Philippine Sea, Mitcher dispatched a bombing mission against the fleeing Japanese fleet. As the pilots were returning home from their mission, however, it was pitch dark, completely black. And to make matters worse, the fleet was under strict blackout orders. Lights on the carrier were off to help them stay hidden in the darkness. The pilots, though, were running out of fuel, and there was increasing fear that they would never be able to find their way back to the carrier in time. To add to this fear, even if they did make it back in time, how would it even matter if they couldn't see where they were about to land? So the admiral took a chance. He turned on the lights. One of the pilots later described the scene as a Hollywood premiere, Chinese New Year's, and the 4th of July all rolled into one. Guided by the light, running out of gas, the pilots were able to find their carriers. And the ones that did end up running out of gas were at least able to ditch their planes near the carrier, greatly reducing any casualties. All because they were able to see a light that must have seemed rather grand to them in the middle of all that darkness. What must it have felt like to be flying in the dark like that? Darkness can feel oppressive, endless, hopeless, and scary. So it's no wonder that a fear of the dark is quite common among humans. And we may think that it's primarily a fear that our kids have, but that's not always the case. An article in the USA Today from March 1st last year claimed that one study shows that as many as 3 out of 4 children have a fear of the dark. Now that number does definitely decrease for adults, but still, 11% of American adults share this same fear. And by the way, that makes it even more prevalent than being afraid of heights, which only affects about 3 to 6% of American adults. 2 weeks ago, we talked about Epiphany. It was timely back then because it was so close to the actual day of Epiphany. But in the Christian calendar, this celebration is still going on. We are in the middle of a whole season dedicated to Epiphany. And Epiphany itself is a celebration of light. We talked about that a couple weeks ago in some different words. Wise men following a star, a light in the dark. Jesus being illuminated by the glory of God after being baptized by John. So it makes sense that some of our readings during this season reflect this idea of light and dark. It even makes sense as you look outside. Our Christmas celebration comes just about when the world is at its darkest. But as we celebrate Epiphany, as we move throughout this season, our days gradually get brighter and brighter. So this week, we started off our readings with a prophecy from the book of Isaiah. Now, part of that prophecy tells us what it was like in the dark. Isaiah begins by talking about a former time in the lands of Zebulun and Naphtali. These lands were conquered. Its citizens lived in bondage. Not only that, but he references Midian at the end. Talks about a day when Israel was held in bondage by the Midianites. These people ended up in slavery. Isaiah talks about the heavy yokes across their shoulders. He talks about rods that issued beatings for the slightest misstep. And I'm sure that you can imagine everything beyond yokes and rods that must have been a part of their daily life. These words were meant to evoke those images of bondage and slavery, the brutality that comes with that. You can bet Isaiah used this language to strike a nerve in his audience. He is once again reminding them of their darkest days, a time when their ancestors were anything but free. But even for us, living thousands of miles away, thousands of years in the future, this imagery still strikes a chord. We have so many ways we continue to live in darkness. That yoke on our shoulder, or that rod that beats us down, It might be figurative. But we have people among us, just outside our doors, or maybe even just inside our doors, that live with darkness. We struggle with the guilt of sin. Think about what it feels like to live with that guilt, to have something weighing on you, to know that you messed up. We struggle with addiction. We struggle with grief. We struggle with lives at home that don't leave us feeling loved, accepted, or sometimes even safe. We struggle with finding answers to life's biggest questions. Why are we here? Where do we fit in? Is God out there? If he is, does he still love us? Is there something more to life than meets the eye? We struggle with health, physically, mentally, emotionally. Those struggles sometimes leave us feeling defeated, maybe even alone and unloved. We struggle with fear. We're afraid of the future, afraid of uncertainty that lies ahead. And I could go on and on. Our world offers no lack of darkness that can consume us. Living in that darkness weighs on us like that yoke from Isaiah's words. It beats us down like that rod. Living in that darkness makes us anything except free. However, Isaiah is telling us that there will come a day when a light will come into that darkness. He's telling us about a day when those lands that lived in oppression will do so no more, when everything that held them down will be shattered. And it's not the first time that our Bible uses this opposition of darkness and light. Think back to Genesis, where it all began. The earth was black, was empty and dark. But the Spirit of God swoops in and says, "Let there be light," and light comes into that darkness. Jesus, much later, enters the figurative darkness of death and the literal darkness of a sealed tomb. But after 3 days, he comes back into the world to be our light to salvation. But even on that morning, the Bible describes Mary and Mary going to the tomb while it was still dark. And they encounter an angel whose appearance was like lightning. And here in Isaiah, we have a people who once walked in darkness and the promise that they will see a great light. Those words that Isaiah spoke or wrote became true. To see it in action, let's read the first part of our gospel reading for today. From Matthew 4, verses 12 through 17. When Jesus heard that John had been put in prison, he withdrew to Galilee. Leaving Nazareth, he went and lived in Capernaum, which was by the lake in the area of Zebulun and Naphtali, to fulfill what was said through the prophet of Isaiah. Land of Zebulun and land of Naphtali, the way of the sea, beyond the Jordan, Galilee of the Gentiles. The people living in darkness have seen a great light. On those living in the land of the shadow of death, a light has dawned. From that time on, Jesus began to preach, "Repent, for the kingdom of heaven has come near." Jesus, through his actions of living in the very same region that Isaiah mentioned, and then by his words, echoing those very same words written by Isaiah, is showing once again that these prophecies are coming true and that they are about him. He's telling them that the light that they had been waiting for has already dawned. It's already here. And so that's the good news for us today. We don't have to wait for that light anymore. The people in Isaiah's time, they were waiting for their light. People in Jesus' time were also still wondering when that light would come to them. But we don't have to wait. We don't have to wonder. All we have to do is look away from the darkness, look away from everything that burdens us and beats us down. We just need to look towards that light and know that Jesus is waiting there. But you know, an interesting thing happens when we turn towards that light. It's not just about recognizing Jesus as that light. Something else happens when we see Jesus in the light of who he really is. To see what that is, let's read our second part of the gospel from Matthew, picking up with verse 18 and finishing with verse 23. As Jesus was walking beside the Sea of Galilee, he saw two brothers, Simon called Peter and his brother Andrew. They were casting a net into the lake, for they were fishermen. "Come, follow me," Jesus said, "and I will send you out to fish for people." At once they left their nets and they followed him. Going on from there, he saw two other brothers, James, son of Zebedee, and his brother John. They were in a boat with their father Zebedee, preparing their nets. Jesus called them, and immediately they left their boat and their father and followed him. Jesus went throughout Galilee, teaching in the synagogues, proclaiming the good news of the kingdom, and healing every disease and sickness among the people. These disciples, these first ones, they had to have known that Jesus was more than what he seemed. I have a hard time believing that some regular Joe would come up to them while they're at work, at their very livelihood, tell them to follow him, and they would just drop it and go. They had to see him and recognize that this was their light in the darkness. In the midst of their daily troubles, this one man comes along and says, "Follow me," and then they listen. There had to be something illuminating about Jesus and what he said to them that day. Now, as I alluded earlier, something else interesting happens here beyond just recognizing that Jesus is the light that they're waiting for. Simon Peter, Andrew, and then James and John, they don't just recognize that this is their light and then go back to their regular lives. They don't see Jesus and then tell people back at home, "Hey, I saw a pretty cool light today." There's something more. They're called into service. Jesus tells them to drop what they're doing and follow him. They're called into a brand new life. Now, Jesus doesn't call everyone to drop what they're doing and leave their jobs in order to follow him. So don't go into work tomorrow and tell your boss that you quit because your pastor said you had to. I'm not telling you that. What I am telling you is that once we see Jesus is the light that picks us up out of darkness, whatever darkness happens to consume us, we start a brand new life. Imagine the Israelites being freed from their oppression only to say, "You know what? We'll just go back to being slaves." And okay, maybe that's not the greatest example because they did kind of have a knack for getting themselves into trouble, only to be delivered from trouble, only to get themselves back into trouble just a little bit later. And we often kind of scoff at that, don't we? How could they be so blind? How could they be so stubborn, set in their ways? But aren't we maybe a little bit like them? Don't we often seem to kind of get comfortable in our darkness? We find excuses to stay where we are. Maybe we think it hides some of our imperfections and our mistakes. We say we're imperfect creatures doing imperfect things, and that is true. And for some, that might work. That might help us hide parts of ourselves that we don't want others to see. Maybe parts that we're embarrassed about and don't really want to show the rest of the world. But we can't hide it from everyone, and we certainly can't hide it from the one that really matters. We want so badly to see that light, to just get that quick feeling of how warm and how loving it is, but then we retreat back to where we were. We're reluctant to follow that call and let it change us for good. The truth is, if we want to be part of that light, a light that casts away all darkness and despair, we have to be willing to let it do its work on us. We have to be willing to answer that call to go deeper and deeper into that light and let it fill more and more of ourselves. Only then do we get to stop walking in darkness. Only then does that part of the prophecy become true for us as well. And we need that light. We need it for ourselves, to pull ourselves out of darkness. We also need it so that we can reflect that light for others as well. Our world is full of darkness. But darkness also offers a chance for light to shine all the brighter. So let's turn towards that light. Let's let it work within us. Let's answer that call that comes next. Let's be a light to help our world truly see Jesus. And all of God's people said,